Evergrande, a Chinese real estate giant, is on the verge of shattering. Fear of an economic impact have scared markets, and the question is whether Evergrande will become the Lehman Brothers of our era. The crisis at Evergrande was sparked by two direct events. As part of the larger crackdown on industries such as the digital platforms and education, Chinese officials launched investigations into property developers' large borrowings, and at the same time, to counter this, Evergrande attempted to sell off some of its assets. However, a gradual weakening of the Chinese housing market and the diminishing demand for new homes constrains revenue flows for the company. The two issues combine to cause Evergrande's cash crunch. The corporation is currently struggling under a $300 billion liability burden, which has destroyed its credit rating and the share prices. It is confronted with roughly 800 incomplete residential buildings and several unpaid suppliers and over a million house buyers who have only paid a portion of the purchase price.
Welcome and thank you for joining us in this segment. We are going to talk about Evergrande and the recent China controversy. In today's segment, we are joined as usual by Mr. Duncan Bartlett, Indo-Pacific editor at the Kootenai. Duncan, welcome and thank you for this segment. So to begin with, Evergrande has accumulated more than $300 billion in debt, making it the world's most indebted developer. What are the circumstances which led this Chinese giant to a brink of collapse?
Evergrande is a property company, one of the largest in the world, and in a nutshell, it appears to be running out of cash. And that's significant because if it can't pay back its loans, that's going to be damaging to all the lenders, most of whom are in China, but some of which are based in other countries around the world, including other countries in Asia, Europe, and the United States. And it's clear that Evergrande is struggling to make payments, both in terms of the money it's borrowed, but also to investors in terms of bonds and its wealth management products. The issue here is the size of Evergrande's debt, which is estimated to be more than 300 billion US dollars. Another serious problem, and this is one for people in China, is that many people have already bought homes from this company, and in some cases they've paid in full, in advance, in cash, but they might not receive the apartments that they've already paid for. So this really raises a lot of questions about the way in which China has handled its property market, and indeed whether Chinese companies are trustworthy. Evergrande's problems have rocked the financial markets. The firm's shares, they're down by 80% since the start of this year. And as we speak, actually, Evergrande shares have been suspended on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange.
Evergrande crisis threatening repercussions for China's real estate, like you have mentioned, many speculating that its impact could spread through China's financial system and reverberate around the world. So what's your take on that?
Well, I foresee two serious problems here. Firstly, it could be a major blow to the Chinese economy. And secondly, this could be a point at which investors have to come to terms with the evidence that piling money into Chinese companies is a very risky activity indeed. In terms of China's economy, the company's total liabilities are equal to about 2% of China's gross domestic product. And when you think what an enormous economy China is now, you'll realize the size of this issue. That's triggered concerns that the problems could spread through the world's entire economy, affecting the whole global financial system, because Evergrande is the biggest and most indebted of China's property companies, but there are other players in that sector as well. Are they any more robust? There's quite literally thousands of new apartments in China which are for sale and no one wants to buy. So at the moment, the sellers are offering them at massive discounts, but there's a surfeit of new homes in China. And the other problem is this: when the Chinese government wants to stimulate the economy, what it's typically done has been to throw public money at the construction sector in the hope that that's going to create job, create more demand, give people safe places to live and so on. That doesn't seem to be working anymore because, as I've just said, there's a surplus of new homes. So China's government and the central bank is actually losing control of one of the key tools that it's been using for its economy. And given that China is an economic superpower and a key trading partner for so many countries around the world, including India, I would say this is a very worrying situation.
Speaking of control, the Chinese government appears to be intervening into the matter now. Do you think this can help Evergrande come out of the crisis? And is it a bailout option that is up on the table?
Well, it's a trust issue. People will be wondering if they can still buy shares in a Chinese company and expect it to survive. Are the accounts reliable? And remember, as we speak, the shares in Evergrande, they've been suspended. So that's a massive red flag. From an investor's perspective, actually, that's the worst case scenario, because you might be left with shares which are completely valueless, or bonds that won't be repaid for that matter. At the moment, Evergrande is defaulting on its bonds as well. So there is an option here, which you've mentioned, which is for the government of China to do a bailout. Other countries have done this sort of thing in a financial crisis. But you've got to ask yourself, if you start bailing out failing companies, where does it stop? If a business makes a terrible, costly mistake and it's rescued for political reasons, what message does that send to businesses and the sector? Doesn't it encourage other companies to take risks or behave in an irresponsible way? These are the very difficult questions that the authorities in China will need to weigh up.
So the last question is that Evergrande has been prioritizing domestic creditors over offshore bondholders, and the company missed its second debt obligation this month for the offshore creditors. How do you think this will impact the trade relations between China and the overseas traders in the future?
Well, the key issue here is the relationship between the business sector and the Chinese Communist Party. And for me, this is a reminder that in communist China, the whole complicated business of raising money, either on the stock exchange or by borrowing from other sources, is still pretty risky. A lot of companies are tied up with the so-called shadow banking sector in China. In other words, it's not really quite clear how much money they've borrowed or who from. And this is a nightmare when things spiral out of control, as things appear to have been going out of control at Everglade. How much are its debts? No one really knows. Who's impacted? We're not really quite sure. And this reminds me a bit of the subprime mortgage crisis in the US, which caused a global economic catastrophe. Just to put this into context, there are actually several signs that the government of China has clamped down on the big Chinese companies this year. There's been regulatory crackdowns in education, computer gaming, and so on. And the value of the Chinese shares listed in places like Shanghai and Hong Kong, that's right down. So investors are already wary. And now, whenever people hear the name Evergrande, they're going to associate this with the risk of doing business in China and the possibility that shares will be suspended. It's too late, basically, for the Chinese government to do much about that reputational damage. But I hope this is an opportunity for the whole system to have a bit of an overhaul and to stop companies borrowing money on the basis of unsustainable business models.
Thank you so much for providing us with an insightful conversation. Thank you to our viewers for joining in. And don't forget to follow the Kutniti for more updates on international relations and diplomacy.